welcome to my channel. My name is Adam W. Rodriguez, and I am your host here at the Art of AWR. For today's video, we are going to be doing the book review for Batman Reptilian by Garth Ennis and art by Liam Sharp. I just reread this book. The first time I read it, I had some mixed emotions about it, so I read it yet another time, and now both readings have merged into this review that I am about to do. I am super excited about it. But before I begin, I would like to invite you to subscribe to my channel. If you like videos about comic books, literature, creativity in general, subscribe to my channel. Maybe like this video and then hit that bell so you get new notifications every time a new episode drops. Awesome. Batman Reptilian. It's really great, and I totally recommend this comic to anybody who is a fan of dark detective noir, sort of cynical approaches to superheroes. This book is for you. I'm going to start talking first about the history. There's an interesting history to this book. I watched this awesome interview on, what's the channel? It's forbiddenplanet.com. I'll leave the link in the description. It was a wonderful interview between Garth Ennis and Liam Sharp talking specifically about Batman Reptilian. In the interview, Garth Ennis talks about how this particular project came about. So originally, this book was going to be the reemergence of the creative team, Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon. Now, Steve Dillon and Garth Ennis were introduced to me at the exact same time with the book Preacher, which I read when it was coming out in the trade paperback form, and I fell in love with this series. It was so great. It was dark, it was gritty, it was hilarious, and the art was stunning and brutal and totally gory, and I couldn't get enough of it. Steve Dillon had also done work in stuff like Punisher and Judge Dredd, you know, books that just kind of scream gore and people getting their heads blown off and fun things like that. Steve Dillon had been sick for a bit, and just as he was starting to get better, him and Garth Ennis got together. They created Batman Reptilian, and this is right about when Preacher, the TV series, was about to come out. And Steve Dillon wanted to kind of get back into the industry, back in the game. They created Batman Reptilian. They got the green light from DC Comics, and right after Garth Ennis finished the script, sadly, Steve Dillon passed away. So about 5 years or so later, Garth Ennis' agent approaches him with, hey, maybe we could do this book with Liam Sharp. Liam Sharp was already a friend and an acquaintance to both Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon, and so he approached it with all of the respect of knowing and admiring the artist that this book was originally written for. And I think Liam Sharp did an excellent job. Here in the first book, there's this dedication to Steve Dillon, you know, for Steve Dillon, a big brother to many of us. The script to this book was meant for him, and I would rather have him here by far than be drawing it myself. L.S. Liam Sharp. This is a wonderful dedication, and you could tell that there was a lot of love between these artists. So I think that is a really cool chunk of history that was totally worth telling before we jump into the review. So let's talk a little bit more about Liam Sharp. I had recognized the name, and then I remembered that he was the guy who did the artwork in Grant Morrison's Green Lantern, which I had read several months prior. I liked that he did this kind of broad range of art styles. He did some of the more traditional stuff, and then he started doing some of the like painting style art for some of the later issues in that run. So that painting style carried over into Reptilian. It was very reminiscent of stuff like Bill Sienkiewicz, who is one of my favorite artists in comics of all time, and Dave McKean, who did Arkham Asylum. Very moody, colorful. The shapes are a little distorted with the design to cause fear. When I put both of these artists like side to side, like when I think about what Steve Dillon's approach probably would have been, and then I see what Liam Sharp's approach was. Like, I think that Steve Dillon, who was excellent at stuff like facial expressions and brutality and grim, gruesome art that still was beautiful to look at, it was quite fascinating in many ways, his approach would have definitely leaned on that strength in his art style. Whereas Liam Sharp didn't go into the gore as much, if any, really, in this book. But what he did do was lean heavy into the kind of dark detective noir feel, which I think worked really well for him in this book. The book promises this gore and brutality in the dialogue and the story that it is that is given. But once again, it was written for Dillon and it was painted by Sharp. Two different approaches, two different artists. I would have loved to have seen what Dillon do. I would have loved to have seen what Dillon do. But I really like what Liam Sharp did. So there's that. Let's talk about Garth Ennis's approach to the writing. Garth Ennis has been quoted many times as a man who is not terribly fond of superheroes. He has a very cynical approach to his superheroes. If you haven't watched The Boys, watch The Boys. If you haven't read The Boys, read The Boys. It's totally Garth Ennis's absolute disgust in superheroes, all bottled up into one sweet package of books. They're delightful, they're awful, they're gory, they make me sick, and I can't get enough of it. They're great, great stories. Garth Ennis is one of these guys who can take awful scenarios and really, really grim subject matter and make it fascinating and interesting, and I can't put it down most of the time. So he takes a lot of that same grim, cynical nature and takes it into Batman. You can tell he's not a huge fan of Batman. Batman is this rich guy who probably would be doing better if he was actually using his wealth to, I don't know, stimulate the economy so that poor people aren't so poor, so that crime isn't so bad. But he does end up preferring just putting on a costume and just beating the crap out of a bunch of like blue-collar goons who are just trying to not starve to death. And yeah, I get it, you know, criminal elements, yada, yada, yada. We live in a different time, and I think that this approach to superheroes is fascinating, and I can't get enough of it. I like it when people take the mythologies that we're so used to and that some people just hold so sacred and just mess it up, or at least throw in these viewpoints that not everybody associates with superheroes. Taking your superheroes, your beloved superheroes, and showing you the darker, more sardonic style of their existence. And that's exactly what Garth Ennis does in this book. He's a funny, funny guy, and that's one of the other things that I really like about him. His dialogue is great. There's these wonderful moments between Bruce Wayne and Alfred where they're just kind of busting each other's chops. At the same time, they obviously care about each other. They've got this kind of brotherly love. It didn't feel like that kind of empty father figure love that we're also used to with Alfred and Bruce Wayne. It definitely felt more like an employer-employee relationship, which is interesting. One of the things I really like is Garth Ennis's relationships that he has between Batman and the villains. There's some wonderful quippy dialogue between Batman and one of the main villains in the back end of the book, where they're just like so familiar with each other because they've been fighting each other for so darn long, and it's just kind of quippy and it's hilarious. It's hilarious how like he can be so nonchalant about this character who's a murderer and this grisly horror, and Batman's just like meh, 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 just busting his chops like he's anybody. And it's pretty awesome, like how they just go back and forth. This kind of old familiar, you know, like, oh, you again. And his approach to the villains are also in that same vein. There's nothing terribly sacred in the villain category either. His approach to the Joker was, and I'm not a guy that's like so like hardcore, like the Joker's got to be great, man. The Joker's got to be great. But like he really just punks the Joker in this book to the point where like you could just tell the Joker is just a joke in his universe. And it plays out just fine. In fact, it's kind of funny how it does play out. I think the first time I read this, I was like, man, come on, really? And then the second time I was like, I guess it's kind of funny. And then the third time I was like, yeah, this is hilarious. Okay. I mean, I myself suffer from this all the time. I randomly think that the stuff is so sacred that when you give me this kind of grim, mocking attitude towards my superheroes, I get all like, what did you do? You know? But that's what I like about Garth Ennis. You know what I mean? So he does. He likes to just mess with you like that. He messes with the fans. I really dig that about him. But that's one of the reasons why I think his characters that he creates work so well. Because he's not being sardonic about something that you already love. He's creating characters that are brand new and showing you these aren't entirely great people. You shouldn't admire them necessarily. They're flawed. They have dark sides. They do bad things sometimes. And that just makes them more human, more fleshed out. And that's what I like about it, is he takes these kind of two-dimensional, cartoonish superhero archetypes and gives them so much dimension that you don't like what you see. And I think that's great about Garth Ennis' writing. Let's just go ahead and talk about the story just in general. I'm not going to throw any spoilers out, but what I like about it is that it is a detective story. It's Batman following clues from book to book to book. And throughout each book, you get to meet random characters through the Rogues Gallery. They mention pretty much everybody. You don't necessarily have scenes with everybody, which is fine, but I like that he does nods to all the standard characters. But speaking of how Garth Ennis likes to take the mythology and twist it around, what he does at the back end of this book is just nuts. Like, it's so weird and grotesque and really neat. Like, by the end, like the first time I read it, I was just like, what the hell is this? And by the time I put it down, and I was just like, I don't know what I think about that. And then the next two reads, the more and more I came to really, really like it. I like it when writers take these creatures and just add to them. It was one of the things that I loved about like Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. Was like Swamp Thing was a completely different entity by the end of his run. And in this case, at the end of this run of Reptilian, one particular Batman villain is a completely different creature by the end of the run. You're like, wow, there's a whole bunch of extra dimensions to that guy that I never knew about, that nobody had ever considered. And it was weird. It was gruesome. It made for part of his madness. And I thought it was great. So Batman Reptilian is written under the Black label, which is kind of like how Vertigo used to work. You have your more adult content DC Comics, or DC Comics that just want to have a one singular universe or one singular one-off story that doesn't necessarily affect the DC universe at large, outside of the Black label. So those tended to be most of the DC books that I read most of the time. It's actually where I discovered Preacher and stuff like that. So Black label is exactly the stomping ground of guys like Garth Ennis. And what he did was great. It'll probably never see the light of day in the proper DC universe, but that's fine, because this is a cool story, all encompassed into one, and I quite liked it. It was very delightful. Garth Ennis is great. Liam Sharp is great. So, yeah, you heard all my pros, you heard all my cons. Some of my main pros are stuff like Garth Ennis' writing is hilarious. I love how he worked on the relationships between Batman and the villains, Bruce Wayne and Alfred. Some really, really cool writing. It's a really fun detective story, and I like that it gets really odd and strange at the end of the book. Solid prose. Solid prose on the art, the noir detective style, very dark. I like how things are a little distorted. I like how Liam Sharp took pages from Dave McKean and Bill Sienkiewicz in his painting styles. Everything's very mad and broody, and I like that a lot too. My cons in general is that maybe it's a little too dark as far as the art is concerned. I remember having to like read this in good light, because if I read it with any bit of shade in the room, I would miss aspects of the art. And it could be that I'm old and have bad eyes, but it also could just be that the artwork is like so saturated with darkness that you have to have a certain light to really appreciate everything that's going on in here. And I found that kind of off-putting. And, I mean, I guess it's really not fair, but I wanted to see a little bit more gore, because the writing was telling me that there was gore, and I wanted to see it, and I didn't get to see much of that. So that's kind of a con in my book as well. Yeah, and as far as cons are concerned in the writing, honestly, the only time my eyes rolled really big were how the Joker got punked. And I'm not one of those guys who's like, oh, the Joker is the greatest villain of all time. But I want there to be a little bit of gravity to him, and he treated them like a clown. And I understand why. I just wasn't into it. So that's my one little jab, I guess. But honestly, the writing is brilliant. I think Garth Ennis is a brilliant writer. So, all that being said, I would give this book an 8. It's a solid 8. It was one of my favorite things that I've read this year as far as comics are concerned, and I would suggest it to any lovers of Batman, any lovers of grim detective stories. Anybody who likes Garth Ennis is going to like this book. It's got all of his signatures all up in here, so it's delightful. It's delightful gallows humor, and it's a fun take on some of the Batman mythology. Solid book. I totally recommend it to Batman lovers and grim lovers everywhere. Awesome. Well, that was my review of Batman Reptilian by Garth Ennis, art by Liam Sharp. I hope you enjoyed. I know I did. I've got a whole bunch of other reviews coming up down the pipe, so keep your eyes peeled. But until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.